Hi, everybody. Welcome to Springs in the Desert Women at the Well virtual book club. I'm Allie, and I'm here with Kimberly and Stacey, and we're so excited to be back with you again to discuss our second episode on The Secret Diary of Elisabeth Leseur. We met last time to talk about Elisabeth's spiritual maternity, and today we're going to be discussing kind of more of her interior life, her prayer life. Before we get started, though, I just wanted to kind of back up and recall that last time we went over more of like her biography and kind of when and where she lived and what the circumstances of her life were. So if you missed that, feel free to go back and listen again to kind of get that background. But I wanted to specifically mention that we know for a fact that she and her husband Felix were childless, and there are several examples of saints and blesseds throughout history who have dealt with this cross. It's kind of rare that we hear them speak about it, I think. Y'all might know different examples, but I haven't heard too many saints that actually have spoken about childlessness or infertility. But in this Secret Diary of Elisabeth Leseur, there are a few kind of very small references to their struggle with infertility, and one of them is in the beginning. There's an introduction written by Elisabeth's husband, Felix, in which he says that basically infertility and her, that if God had willed Elisabeth to have children, that this was her great desire, and the privation was an inconsolable grief. So we know from that it was something that they dealt with and something that brought them, and particularly Elisabeth, great sorrow. So I find a lot of solidarity with her, even from reading that single line, and just knowing that this is something that she dealt with. So I just wanted to mention that as we kind of opened up here. But as I said, we're going to be talking about her interior life today and her prayer life. And I do not have a background in theology, but my two co-hostesses, Stacey and Kimberly, do. So I wanted to just start off with talking about, like, what do we mean from a Catholic perspective when we say the interior life of a particular person? How are we to understand that? So I wanted to open that up for Stacey and Kimberly to kind of chime in on.
Sure. So I think what's so remarkable about Elisabeth Leseur is her steadfastness and her deep trust. It reminds me a lot of Saint Teresa of Avila, who Elisabeth Leseur was well versed in. She quotes her, and just her concept of having an interior dwelling place, where she is alone with God and with Jesus, and her soul finds deep peace and deep rest in that relationship and that unity and oneness with Jesus. To me, that's the core of her interior life. But there's a lot more to it than that. But I see a lot of connection between her and Teresa of Avila. Yeah. Do you want to add anything, Kim?
No, I just agree with that, and just think that this was it. To me, it just gives you, I feel like it gives you so much hope, because when everything around you is falling apart, everything, your relationships, your dreams, your ideals, your hopes, your everything falling apart, you can still retreat to that place. And you can be growing and developing your relationship with God. Oftentimes, you can do it more fruitfully and intentionally when there aren't so many distractions around. But it is such an encouragement to me. When people who are these saints who have suffered so greatly, and they're basically oftentimes suffering to such a degree they can't even leave their bed, for instance. But yet they're experiencing great, deep peace and joy and this union with God. it helps me to feel like there's nothing to ever be afraid of. Like nothing is going to separate us from the love of Christ. Nothing. And it's very encouraging to hear that a saint, well, she's not specifically a canonized saint yet, but to hear her speak of that constant focus on developing her interior life, and then that constant joy and peace that that brings to her. So anyway, I think it gives us a lot of hope.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I was thinking about as I was reading, about reading her diary and thinking about the way that she prays and kind of her relationship with God is how strikingly different it is from the many, many times that we might think about prayer today. I was telling Stacey before this a story about a homily I heard last weekend where the priest basically told a story about a childless couple who, weren't able to have children, and another priest had offered to pray, light candles for them at some Roman basilicas. And lo and behold, he shows up a few years later and they have, multiple sets of triplets and twins and singles. And the punchline was, oh, well, the husband went to go blow out the candles because, the prayers had been answered. And I was like, man, this is interesting to hear this during a homily, because I think that there's something true about that. Like we ask for what we want, and we aren't afraid to ask God for the things that are most on our heart. And obviously with infertility, a lot of that is asking for a baby. And but I think that there can be like this temptation to, well, if I just pray this novena, or, if I just drink this milk powder or do this this particular devotion, that like God will then answer my prayer. And sometimes we even hear that like from priests or from spiritual people. And that's, I think, a really hard thing to deal with, because I think, at least for me, somewhere deep down, like that's not what I really want to hear. Like it doesn't bring me comfort, because what I want to hear is like, God will provide for you. I don't know how, it's a mystery. But he loves you and he wants you to have joy and peace and all the things he wants to give. And I think Elisabeth's story is just such a powerful witness that it almost counteracts these sometimes difficult things we might hear from people. It's like, no, no matter what goes on in your life, that we can trust God, and then he does want our best. I think there's a quote on page 51 where she says something like, she's talking about like the task of the moment. And she says, after all, the workman does not choose his task. The child submits to the tender will of the father. The only important thing is to perform my task. The circumstances and the means offered to me matter little. It is true that I shall have less human joy and comfort than if I lived in the midst of Christian friends and hearts. But I know by experience how God supplies all that is lacking, and with what generosity he gives us what outward circumstances deny us. And I just love that, because I feel like you could substitute in infertility for, her Christian desire for Christian friends and family. And just that trust and that faith that she has that, even if those prayers, which are beautiful prayers, like aren't answered, that he still will provide. So.
Yeah, if I could add to that, I think that our culture and our society, even Catholic culture and society, their first response to infertility is, what can we do to get a baby in this woman's arms as fast as possible? And I appreciate the care, but also I think what we're looking for is not necessarily to have a baby in our arms as fast as possible, but to find like peace and healing and knowledge of our own belovedness as daughters of God. And Elisabeth just had that to an incredible degree. Just her awareness of union with Christ through the experience of suffering. And Allie and I were chatting a little bit before this, and we talked about how I mentioned how there's sort of like two ways that you can have interior life, and one is wrong and one is right. Obviously, Elisabeth's is the right way to happen into your life. But there's this temptation sometimes, I think, to keep our like suffering and our pain to ourselves and not share it with anybody else, because we're like, it's mine. Like, I have to deal with this. Nobody else understands what I'm going through. So I'm just going to keep it to myself because they tell me the wrong things, which I've definitely fallen into that category at times. But Elisabeth, I think just through her deep interior life, is able to move her suffering, like allow her suffering to be transformed so that it unites her more deeply to Jesus. And that's the difference between this interior life of like suffering for like almost to turn inwards on yourself, or in this case with Elisabeth, the right way to suffer is to like allow it to unite you with Jesus. So it's not as though it isolates you, but it unites you. And we're also just thinking, how on earth does she get to this point? Because I think this diary is so good, but it's only a small glimpse into the life of Elisabeth. And she does have a spiritual guide that helps, like, works with her and helps to develop her interior life. And I really feel like he must have done a lot of work with her, because I can't imagine like the experiences she's gone through to be able to like allow herself to be transformed to this point where she just is so deeply united with Jesus interiorly. And I feel like I'm running away with this, but her resolutions also struck me so deeply, that she's always striving. So I just said a lot. So if anybody wants to pick up on those things or add something, go ahead.
No, it's true. She's so steadfast in that her commitment to her resolutions, which, you know, I think, I know I can become like focused on one area perhaps, and I focus on that for a little while, and then I sort of work on something else, for instance, and she just is constantly focused on her duties and what, you know, first and foremost to her family, to her husband, and to her, you know, her mother, her sister, her godchildren, her niece, nephews. She's focused on tending to the duties, but also, you know, her obligations to her friends and the people in her circle. And it's very beautiful because she's not out there trying to save the whole world. Like, she knows very much, you know, she's trying to focus on who belongs to her, who has God given her, and to constantly focus on praying and making resolutions that she's not going to talk about her suffering, that she's not going to talk about even her faith in a way that might not be well received by other people. She keeps it to herself so that she just is shining forth as an example of Christian love. And it just, you know, she's constantly like, I want to always have a smile on my face, regardless of all the pain I'm in. I want to offer up that pain and be cheerful and not talk about myself and offer up mortifications. And she's just doing it all the time. And I mean, that's, you know, that daily habit, I guess, of just really keep pressing in and asking God that when things, she's like, when I'm really suffering, I'm going to increase my prayer life and increase my mortifications, which is like, you know, when I'm really suffering, I'm like, I need a bath and some chocolate. I need to increase my mortifications, you know, where it's like, you want to like call, you know, just have some comfort, you know, and as opposed to like, she sees it as an opportunity to like press in and to really grow even closer in union with Christ during those really difficult times.
Can I add a quote?
Yeah.
So page 102, she talks about sorrows of life, her trials, illness, and painful infirmities. And I think you can add in there infertility. She says, the sorrows of life are dear companions who have been so faithful to me. That is remarkable. She talks about loving her pain and her sorrows because they've helped unite her. If we flip to page 110, she talks about union with Jesus through her suffering on earth, and how her suffering has enabled her to be united to the divine heart of Jesus Christ. Whoa.
Yeah, those are all like, it's just amazing to read those words. It's like, how, I think you both brought up good points. Like, how do you get there practically? And you said it, Kimberly, it's like, she didn't just get there overnight. It's like her daily practices. And you brought up, Stacey, that she had a spiritual director. So obviously, like, that was one piece of it, of her development of her interior life, and just having that wisdom that she was able to share. But I was also struck by, like, this is a unique book in that we actually get like a breakdown of her daily practices and what she did. You know, we have her spiritual resolutions as far as, you know, year to year, month to month, what she strove to really incorporate in her life. And I think one thing that stood out to me was she's constantly talking about how every day making a meditation is just essential. It's like the backbone of everything else. And specifically, she spoke about reading the Gospels or spending time with the epistles, so the New Testament and the life of Christ. And I think it's like, there's a few times when she talks about how this is just the way that she needs to kind of set up her whole day. But on page 13 specifically, she says, God is indeed there when I read the Gospels and epistles. From this reading, I come each day calmed and strengthened. My will is reinforced there and my heart warmed. God, the supreme teacher, through this book of books, educates my inmost being. It helps me to understand life, to smile at duty, and to will strongly. And so I got to do, I think I've spoken about this before, but I got to do an Ignatian like daily retreat this past Lent. And that was basically what we did, is read scripture every day and just spend time, like 20 to 30 minutes, just meditating on it, which is not something I'd done a lot of before. But it was definitely life-changing. Like, it, just that daily practice of, you know, remembering who we are in God's eyes, like you're talking about, Stacey, that you're a daughter of God and that he loves me and has a plan. And I'm nowhere near where Elisabeth is, but I can see that the truth of what she's saying, that is like the fuel for all these other amazing things that she was able to do in her life, and the relationship that she grew to have and the sufferings that she was able to take on. It all started from this like daily practice of spending time with the Word of God, I think. And then from there, obviously, there were other devotions. I was just curious what stood out to you guys with her her daily practice, if anything.
I had a thought. It is not specific to the daily practice, though, but I feeling inspired. So the way that her approach to virtues, like the virtue of trust and the virtue of hope and peace, and how she sees them not as something that you achieve, but as a gift from God. I think that speaks to, I think sometimes the suffering that we like have as women with infertility is when people tell us like, oh, just trust God more. Oh, just have hope. Like, as if it was something that's like our choice to just make up in that moment, right? To just like pull hope or trust out of thin air, which is not something you can do. But just the way that she recognizes that those things like reside in God's grace and are a gift from him, and that doesn't mean that we don't have to do anything. We have to pray and ask for those gifts to be given to us and to receive them. But I guess her posture of like being open to receiving hope and receiving peace and receiving trust is so important. It is such an integral part of her spiritual life, to be receiving, as opposed to, and I think that's why those comments can feel so hurtful from other people, because it's like, okay, I'm coming to you because I'm struggling with trust, I'm struggling with hope, I'm struggling with peace. So, but yet, like, we're told to just make it up out of nowhere. Whereas she really sees it as something that's received. Yeah, if that makes sense.
And she asks for it. Like, she actually writes in there, like, I'm asking God for this particular virtue, as opposed to, like you said, just, I'm trusting him today. Like, it's a prayer. It's part of her prayer.
And that's when it becomes like a resolution, because she's praying this prayer, God, give me hope. God, give me trust, because I don't have it.
Yeah.
In this moment, I need it.
And you see the suffering that she goes through when she loses her sister. And here she has just begged for healing and prayed for her and stood beside her and loved her really with, like, it feels like God's heart. I mean, she just loves her sister so much. And it's a beautiful, beautiful, pure love she has. And then her prayer, her sister dies. And she goes through a profound suffering, but she in that continues to just make that resolution to trust God, to trust him, that he knows what he's doing. He has a plan. I mean, that is so hard to do when our prayers don't turn out the way that we hope. But she knows, like, she just is steadfast that God is good and that God has a plan and that she's going to trust him. And so you see her really, it's beautiful because you see her really struggling and writing about her struggle, but then but thy will be done, in that sense of, like, that God has this under control, and that, God had a plan for this and he knew this would happen. And she continues. So it's just the connection between her and God is just always growing stronger and stronger. She doesn't try to, like, detach herself and go, like, you didn't answer the way I wanted you to, so I'm not going to talk to you for a while. It's like, okay, I have nowhere else to go. Like, Lord, I trust that you love her more than I do. And you're with me in this. And so she allows it just to deepen her connection with God, her reliance on him.
Mm. Okay, I found the really beautiful quote that I was looking for earlier. I want to read it. It's on page 157. She says, "A few moments of recollection and meditation each morning in the presence of God transforms and perfumes the whole day, like flowers cast about when night comes, whose fragrance at dawn anoints everything they have touched." Isn't that beautiful?
That's so true.
It's like she has this awareness. I mean, we spoke about this with spiritual motherhood, about how she has this awareness of how every action has meaning, like, eternally. It's like the same with the prayer aspect of her life. It's like she has this awareness that, okay, I'm not just saying, one more decade of the rosary to, like, check it off the list. It's, like, deeply meaningful and has, like, a profound impact in some way that I may not understand right now. But anyway, that's something that, because I know sometimes, like, waking up and doing these things again and again and again can feel tedious, but it's like, it anoints everything that it has touched. I mean, yeah.
I think especially in the face of suffering, specific suffering, it gets more tedious to do these things, and we start to turn inwards, and we in some cases stop doing these things like prayer, and our relationship with God just dries up, and you feel just, like, deserted, right? But that's not what she does. The opposite, right? Because she understands the eternal dimensions of her actions. When you mentioned that concept, it reminded me of a quote on page 271. She says, "Every human being is an incalculable force, bearing within him something of the future, to the end of time, our daily words and actions will bear fruit. I'm thinking about her daily meditation, right? Her daily prayer, either good or bad. Nothing that we have once given of ourselves will perish, but our words and our works handed on from one to another will continue to do good or harm to remote generations. That is why life is a sacred thing, and we ought not to pass through it thoughtlessly, but to appreciate its value and use it so that when we are gone, the sum total of good in the world may be greater. And then, if I may continue, on page 282, she says, only in eternity, when all secrets are made known, we shall learn all that she thus obtained for you. She's speaking of Juliet, I believe, who passed away, I think. Yes. And by what trials, faith, a Christian life, and perhaps all those human joys that she never tasted were won for you. So just that concept of the eternal dimensions of her actions, of how much that little small tiny choice to say to do morning prayers or to enter daily into meditation, how much that impacts eternity, not just this moment and not just this day and what my approach is to this day, whether I see suffering as this burden or suffering as this sweet treasure gift from God, but it has eternal dimensions. That's amazing how she's able to live her life and navigate it that way.
And to add on to that, even, and then, the small mortifications that we can make, how those have such significance, which they may not, and they may be seen only to God, and that makes them even sweeter, right? I mean, just tiny little mortifications, like I'm going to take a smaller piece of food for lunch instead, and I'm going to give this to my husband instead, and just little things that nobody else knows about, but it's a little mortification for you, a little tiny mortification, but it strengthens your will, and it has, it's amazing to think of the eternal impact of just these little tiny practices that we can do to strengthen that cord, that bond with God, our reliance on him. And, she's constantly praying for everybody around her. I love how she's talking about how the sacrifices of some can, give benefits to others, like she just mentioned there. So
Kimberly, that reminds me in the beginning when her husband's writing about her, which is one of my favorite parts of the books to read, because her husband's writing about her, but they share a letter that she wrote to a friend who was experiencing suffering. And it's so beautiful to see her sympathy and affection for this person, and how it's not as though she just says to this friend, oh, you need to offer it up. Which is something we hear so often, right? Just offer it up. But just recognizing the pain and the suffering, but then being bold enough to not say just offer it up, but to say we can unite our suffering. We can unite our suffering to each other. I see your suffering. I see what you're going through. Let's unite this to Christ and the cross.
I love that. I also love how so much of what she's doing, this is a lay person. We can remember that again. She's a married woman. And yes, she lives at a different time, and there are other things that kind of separate her from us. But I feel so often when we think about these devotions and, acts of mortification, we think of religious only, or that, that's something that priests and nuns do, but that we aren't necessarily called to as lay people. But she really breaks it down and talks about how even in her particular situation, so she lives in upper class Parisian society, and in one of her spiritual writings, she's talking about, well, how can I live out poverty in my vocation? And clearly she's not called to a certain level of material poverty, although she strives for that in little ways, like you're kind of talking about, Kimberly, giving up certain things or giving them to other people. But then she talks about, like, what does it mean to have spiritual poverty or poverty of heart? And she talks about like detachment, and how she can, even if she can't give up certain material things because of her life, like she can release her attachment to those things, like her attachment to possessions or position or how other people think of her. And I just find that there's so much to relate to there as a married person myself, and particularly with infertility. Andrea spoke about this during our last Facebook session so beautifully, but releasing that attachment to like a particular kind of motherhood. And that's a really hard thing to do, but I think Elisabeth shows us through her example that it's possible, and we can pray for that. Like we can pray for, God, release me from this attachment to this particular way that my motherhood may manifest, not like from motherhood completely, because it's part of who we are, but as women, but this particular attachment that I have to, like, it has to look this way. And I think, Kimberly, you've spoken about this too, right?
Yeah, definitely, because I think that we can be so, just consumed with our desire, what we want, and the way it will look and the way it should look, that, I mean, that's why the IVF industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry. It's like that, just going after, I want to be pregnant. No, I don't want to even consider, adoption or fostering or something. I mean, because those are scary paths. I mean, really, all of it is scary. All of it is scary. Having biological children, having no children, fostering, adopting, all of it is scary, and it requires us to let go of this illusion of control that we have, because there are women that get pregnant very easily, and then actually they have hyperfertility, and they're getting pregnant and not able, like, just feeling so overwhelmed with having children, and they're like, this isn't what I imagined it to be. And you see the pretty little pictures. I mean, I love pretty little pictures with kids and everything, but like the day in, day out can be grueling and exhausting. And at the end of the day, you're like, I'm a terrible mother. I'm a terrible, I yelled at my children. And then those illusions of what you thought being a mother was going to look like come crashing down. So that's why it's just, I find such comfort in this book, because I feel like she continues to go back to, Lord, what is your vision? What is your vision? And I mean, this is something that I think we need to be talking about to everybody, is like changing the way, we have this American mindset, you get this vision of what you want and you go after it, you just go for it and you work hard and you make it happen. And I'm a go-getter. So I've always thought that way. But it's very opposite in the Christian world. It's like, okay, what is it that God really wants me? He wants me to conquer myself, my selfishness, like my attachments to my own vision of things. He wants me to conquer that. And that's way harder than, I don't know, trying to achieve some external goal, is trying to really, conquer those things inside. So once we've been able to grow closer to the Lord, I think, and more say, well, what do you want, Lord? What do you want? Like, I forget it. Let me just get rid of my attachments and let me just want what you want. We will begin to have that peace and allow him to guide us. But
so to kind of wrap up here, we just want to encourage you guys to, if you haven't picked up the book yet, definitely, it's really worth it. It's not the kind of book you have to read cover to cover to get something out of. You could literally read a couple pages and you would be just blown away with wisdom and really some things to chew on for a while. But I wanted to specifically mention that Elisabeth has a detailed section about her monthly spiritual retreats. And each month she dedicates to a particular like virtue or something that she wants to work on. Yeah, practice, like poverty of spirit or detachment of soul or obedience. And I think these are really practical ways that we could just spend some time with one of them. And obviously this is a woman who struggled with infertility also, although she doesn't specifically talk about that in these monthly spiritual retreats, it's certainly, I think you can find a lot to relate to the experience of infertility and other crosses that you may be dealing with in your life. So just wanted to point that out. And then to wrap up, we are going to do another episode that'll be released in a couple weeks. And that'll be more focused on Elisabeth's marriage to Felix and some of the struggles that they dealt with, him not being a believer, and just how she was really able to allow that to kind of even draw her deeper in intimacy with Christ while still having a good marriage and growing with Felix as she did. So stay tuned for that. Please check us out on our social media platforms. We're going to have some discussions going on this book. Even if you haven't read, please feel free to chime in and join us. We'd love to hear what you have to say. And then finally, please subscribe to our podcast. And also, if you would, please rate and review it on Apple Podcasts. That will help us to reach more people, so they'll be able to see the review and they'll be able to find the podcast that way. I think that's it. So until next time, it's been a pleasure being with y'all, and thanks again for joining us for this Women at the Well virtual book club series.